My name is Margaret Kernan. I'm speaking to you from the city of Leiden in the Netherlands. I'd like to welcome you to the first in the 2017 series of webinars which are part of the Early Childhood Workforce Initiative. This initiative is hosted by International Step-by-Step Association and Results for Development. This year's webinars are being organized in partnership with International Child Development Initiatives. The topic of today's webinar is early childhood practitioners as advocates and activists. The terms advocate and activist are somehow linked and may mean something different depending on which part of the world you are in. Most simply, an advocate is someone who speaks on behalf of another person or group. An activist is someone who takes action to bring about change. I'm delighted to say that early childhood practitioners as advocates and activists is an issue that has attracted your interest. So, a special welcome to you, the listeners, who are joining us from all continents, from places as diverse as Sao Paulo, Nairobi, New York, Sofia, and Kathmandu. Some of you have already submitted questions which you would like to be discussed today, and you'll see 4 of those questions on the screen in front of you now. Question 1. What does early childhood activism and advocating look like in different countries? Number 2. How do you successfully carry out early childhood advocacy? Number 3. Does activism in early childhood practice need to be public, vocal, and visible? And another question somebody asked, should initial training of early childhood practitioners include content on activism? We have a really interesting panel today who will be talking to you about their own experience on these issues. Next slide. Yeah. But before introducing you to our panelists, I'd first like you to acknowledge the financial support of Early Childhood Workforce Initiative, the supporters. We have 4 supporters: Byrne van Leer Foundation, the Alma Foundation, Open Society Foundations, and the Jacobs Foundation. Without their support, this initiative would not be possible. Now to our panelists. Firstly, Emma Byrne McNamee is joining us from Dublin, Ireland. Emma tells me that she has activism in her blood. She is the daughter of a mother absolutely committed to community development and political engagement. Emma has put a lot of thought, based on many years' experience, into professional identity in the early years sector, which she is going to talk about today. Then we have Dr. Margie Wally and Felicity Norton, joining us from England. Margie has been at the head of the Penn Green Centre for Children and Their Families since it was established in 1983, which is located in Corby in the UK, and is now its research associate. Fair to say that Margie is a legend, at least in Europe, when it comes to advocacy work with children and their families. Also good to know that Margie has experience in community development work in Brazil and Papua New Guinea, as well as in England. Felicity, her colleague, is the deputy head of the Penn Green Centre. Advocacy and activism is at the heart of their work with children, parents, and practitioners. Now I'm going to explain a little bit more about how we plan on using the next 75 minutes or so. There will be 2 presentations, one from Emma, firstly, and then a second one, a joint one from Felicity and Margie. Each of the presentations will be about 10 minutes. After each presentation, we will have time for a few questions. You will be able to see the presentation on your screen all going well, and hopefully the sound quality is also good for you. The presentations themselves and some background documents are also available to you both during the webinar and afterwards. If you would like to submit a question during the webinar, you can type your question directly in the questions panel on the bottom right side of the screen. We'll try our best to address at least a few of your questions. Finally, the recording of today's webinar, the presentations and the background documents will be available on the website, just in case you need to leave early today or you would like to recommend this webinar to your colleagues to listen to. Now I'm going to hand over to Emma Byrne McNamee, our first panelist. Emma will be talking about early years practitioners both as advocates, speaking on behalf of young children and their rights, but she'll also be talking about early years practitioners speaking out on behalf of the profession itself. So over to you now, Emma.
Thank you, Margaret. Hi from Dublin, everybody. So to sufficiently reflect on any aspect of our work and to build meaningful professional discourse, I believe that we always need to start with ourselves as individuals. My own background is as an early childhood educator whose main goal in choosing this profession was to seek to impact on children's lives in a positive way. When I set this out here and when recently I listened to first-year early childhood education degree students articulating their professional motivation in very similar ways, I'm struck by how simplistic it sounds as an objective, but yet how complex it is to achieve. Activism and advocacy, it was always a feature in my own life as I was brought up, as Margaret said, by a mother who had no problem challenging inequality and injustice in both the personal and the political context. I know that when I started my professional life, it was with a comparatively narrow focus on the child alone, but as I became a more experienced early childhood practitioner, I learned about the importance of working in partnership with parents to be able to enhance and enrich their ability to support their children's needs and experiences. And I'm pleased that this is now a component of early years professional practice, which is regarded as essential. Many years later, I now find myself in a training and development role, engaging with a range of early childhood practitioners who work in settings which are in some of the most economically disadvantaged communities in Ireland. The challenges for them seem very similar to those of 30 years ago, and there are now even some new and additional ones. There are more than 25,000 early childhood practitioners, mostly women, working in Ireland, and fees paid by parents to access early childhood education and care here are among the highest in Europe, at an average of over €750 per child per month. However, the average salary for early childhood practitioners is actually below the average industrial wage, even when those practitioners might have attained college degrees in their field. It's been my experience as both a practitioner and a leader within our profession that the dichotomy between care and education, which has been identified in so much of the literature and the analysis relating to early childhood education and care, that exists both within settings, with those who nurture the youngest children getting the least recognition, and within society, where the disparity continues between status, terms and conditions of employment of those who work in the statutory sector as teachers and those who are employed in the non-statutory, which includes community, voluntary and private services for young children. I believe that this inequality both constructs and constrains our professional identity and determines to some extent that any emergent advocacy will focus mainly, if not wholly, on improving these areas, rather than perhaps enabling us to be true to the roots of our profession and engage in ongoing critical activism through our daily practice for the advancement of children's needs and rights. Feelings of dissatisfaction among practitioners have become far more apparent within the last couple of years in Ireland, and there's now a momentum building towards attaining better salaries and terms and conditions for our early childhood professional workforce. We have 2 trade unions who are involved in this movement, and increasingly organised events and campaigns are bringing practitioners into public activism to assert the vital importance of their profession. What is interesting and also encouraging is the involvement of parents in some of these events, and they're openly expressing their solidarity with practitioners in an effort to jointly seek affordability for families, sustainability of early years services, and adequacy of pay and conditions for practitioners. Now, back to the individual journey. In the programs that I have been privileged to lead with practitioners over the past number of years, we begin at what we describe as the foundation stage of our work by asking individual practitioners to examine their own motivation and their own vision for deciding to enter the early childhood profession. In this context, we have encouraged practitioners to examine perspectives on the nature and value of their work with children and families. For some people, this might be the first time they have been facilitated to reflect in this way, as the training they have undertaken has usually, if not always, focused on increasing their knowledge and their skills rather than contemplating or building on the vision that they hold for their role or how they plan to effect change. This process that we have done and we have undertaken with practitioners, it can lead to a very valuable articulation of the values that individuals and teams bring to their work. And in some cases, it has resulted in practitioners beginning to actively use enhanced terminology such as early childhood professional to publicly describe their occupation. This in itself can be regarded as a type of advocacy, which has the potential to advance a better understanding and an appreciation of our profession and demonstrate the importance of our engagement with children and families. We hope through this work then to create greater potential for early childhood practitioners to act as agents of change themselves by realising their own role in positively impacting on experiences and outcomes in early childhood within communities where they may very often have grown up themselves. I consider that any analysis of our own professional role and responsibilities requires us to critically question, as we almost never do in the Irish context, whose needs or interests are actually being met by the early childhood education and care system, and to be courageous enough to challenge assumptions which may underpin historical and contemporary constructions of early childhood education and care. While I believe that a lack of affordable childcare inevitably acts as an economic barrier for parents, particularly those who are more susceptible to poverty, and therefore its provision is an essential element of society's support for families, it has long been a fear of mine that framing early childhood care and education only as a service to allow parents to access employment, which has historically been the case, threatens the centrality and the quality of children's experiences as much as it undermines the professional status of the early childhood practitioner, setting the parameters for the role of practitioners as looking after children in place of their parents. Taking an alternative perspective which primarily emphasises the importance for every child of having access to the enriching experience of early childhood care and education serves to highlight the significance and the complexity of the role of early childhood education and care practitioners, while also affirming the entitlement of parents to access the best possible services for their children. But this construction does not seem to fit as easily within public discourse, particularly here in Ireland. At government level in Ireland, we have had an almost frenetic focus on quality in recent years, which arose mainly from a television expose of practices in a number of private settings which could be considered potentially harmful to children and certainly did not represent the core ethos or the best view of our profession. The experience of having these events discussed and debated on a national level proved really negative for our profession, particularly for some individual practitioners who reported actually being verbally abused by members of the public if they happened to be identified by wearing a uniform as workers within early childhood settings. What was undertaken by the state then in response to this lack of professional practice mainly involved an increase in regulatory requirements, setting of minimum standards for qualifications for staff, and the creation of a new national mentoring service the focus of which is to develop quality. Some of these measures may be delivered within supportive and enabling contexts, but curiously, none of them really has the potential or the power to prevent a reoccurrence of the unacceptable practices which were previously uncovered. In my own opinion, this can really only be addressed by providing strong pedagogical leadership to sustain quality within settings, and this can only be done by firmly grounding practice within a children's rights framework. By maintaining an early years sector which is not appropriately resourced and sustained, the risk of unmotivated workers expressing their own subjugation through oppressive practices with children will remain, in my opinion. And this is where I believe advocacy and activism to achieve better terms and conditions for practitioners could lead to meaningful positive change for our profession. There are some hopeful developments, however. New approaches to offering family support which recognise really formally for the first time the value of involving early childhood practitioners are in fact affording opportunities for practitioners to draw on those roots of our profession to advocate with and on behalf of children and families. Whereas our early childhood curriculum framework has helped to shift a national public focus onto celebrating early childhood as a time of being and of enjoying and learning from experiences as they unfold. Our early childhood education and care workforce has embraced these developments, even though there has been limited training and no additional remuneration for their endeavours, and they have served to further enhance a collective vision for young children between practitioners and parents. Philanthropic and state investment which has been made in projects such as the one in which I have been involved in Preparing for Life, which have prioritised the need to support and enrich the practice of early years professionals working in specific communities, has had another positive effect. We now have senior experienced practitioners emerging from our profession who have had opportunities to design interventions, gather data, develop research and engage with the sector at every level, who are increasingly moving into leadership roles through which activism and advocacy can be productively and positively focused to represent the best interests of our sector and those with whom we engage. I hope and believe that all of these developments combined will offer real possibilities to enhance the view, status and standing of our profession at senior policy level in a national context. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Emma. That was really interesting. You make the link very clearly between working conditions, pay, and practitioners' willingness and ability to be activists or advocates on behalf of children and their families. One of our listeners has asked the question if pre-service training should include content on activism. And I'm wondering, what are your views on this? Because at the end of your presentation, you made a reference to, the hopeful sign being the experienced practitioners now in a good place to be activists and advocates. So I'm wondering about those who are at the beginning stages, in training. Is this something that can be taught?
I'm not sure if it can be taught. I think it can definitely be modelled. I believe that perhaps rather than focusing on content on activism, we really need those of us who are lucky enough to be involved in forming the new professionals, we need to be underpinning all of our work with a strong sense of critical reflection, because I think this will construct their role as the role of an early childhood educator as transformational, both for children's experiences and for wider society. And as for advocacy, I think that in itself is an aspect of what I would describe as professional practice, which does need to be really modelled and encouraged by leaders within settings and across our profession.
So this would be part of professional practice, critical reflection. There was one worrying part of your presentation that I just want to, something a point that you made, and I just want to clarify. You referred to the situation, where practitioners who are very poorly paid, poorly valued, may take out their frustration on their children in their care, and this is where you may see worrying practice. Is that what you were actually saying? Is there a risk there?
I believe it is a risk. I wouldn't like to be simplistic about it, and I don't think it's inevitable, and I think the vast majority of our workforce maintain standards. I suppose I was concerned at the time with the way that the issues that had arisen were framed, and the responses to them were mainly regulatory about oversight, and actually my concern would be that we need to be developing dispositions among our early childhood practitioners which are very focused on the value and impact of their work, rather than holding them to account to a set of regulations which exist somewhat distant from them.
Thanks a lot, Emma. I'm now going to invite Felicity Norton, our second panelist, to introduce the presentation from Penn Green, which will also include some video material. But before I hand over to Felicity, I would just like to invite all of our listeners. You can take a minute now to write down some key phrases yourself to summarize the key insights for you personally that you have come across and what you've heard so far. So now switching to England and to Penn Green, I'm going to invite Felicity, and I would just ask to remind Emma to put your mic on mute, Emma, while we go over to England and talk to Felicity. Felicity, over to you now.
Thank you, Margaret. And just to say, myself and Margie are going to be talking about advocacy, agency and activism at Penn Green. So Margie's going to do the first half of the presentation and I'm going to be doing the second half of the presentation. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Margie Wally to start the presentation off.
Okay, thank you, Liz. Over to the next slide, please. It's very exciting. Can you hear me? Yeah? It's very exciting to be here as part of this. Yeah, it's very exciting to be part of this webinar. And I've only got 5 minutes and I mustn't talk too fast. So I just want to say welcome to everybody who's participating and good morning to those of you in Brazil, because I think it's morning there. I'm 65 and I've always been an activist, but until I became a mother, I was never involved in any kind of traditional leftist activism. I wasn't accustomed to defining an enemy and taking it on, like nuclear disarmament or civil rights. My form of protest has always been focused on actual work that's about doing something better, and it was always child-focused. I think I was a very passionate, angry child, and I became a very passionate teacher. So although I was reading Illich and Cole and Frary and Goffman when in my 20s, I didn't understand the big issues that mattered to me, which was about injustice to children. And I didn't see them as societal, systemic, and all about government policy until I went to Brazil and Papua New Guinea and then came to Corby, where injustice was stark and staring you in the face. And I've loved working in those countries, and I've loved everything about being part of the early years debate. I am interested in engagement, people engaging on their own terms and in their own way. I'm interested in developing critical users of public services, and by this I mean the children and the parents and the staff. I remember when I went back to Brazil to see the project I ran there in 73 to 76, and I met again 2 little boys that I had worked with, and they were remembering what was important about early childhood and the early childhood nursery that we'd run there for them. And they reminded me of a time when I was working in a barrio in Amazonas, in the city of Manaus, when we turned the taps on in the nursery and for 2 weeks there was no water. And we decided to get a film crew from the local film company, and we took the children in a minibus to the governor of the state of Amazonas, and the children and the teachers and I demanded that the water should be turned on. It was amazing the impact of that on that community, because it made us feel that we didn't have to put up with things the way that we were. And when I came back to England, I was excited about the possibilities of working in integrated projects. And I put on this slide how, for me, I see the work of integrated centres for children and families as part of a global project where we work collectively with parents and the wider community. And I do believe that we have the capacity to transform children's life chances if we work in this way. And I firmly believe that what Book says is really important. He's an economist and a wonderful thinker. He talks about there being if there's no explicit emancipatory or empowering vision guiding whatever the project is that you're involved in, that it will be very difficult for you to realize any emancipatory effects. And I put the picture there of 3 small children who were the first children I worked with at Penn Green. And they were outrageous little girls with their hats on their heads and their bags in their hands. And I'm interested in the kind of work that's actually going to transform opportunities for those children. And at Penn Green, we've been running a tracer study, going back and asking the children, what was it that we did that made a difference? And talking to their parents and asking their parents, what was it that we did that made a difference? Did we make any difference indeed? So I am very interested in being a critical reflector on my own practice, and I see critical reflection as very much part of activism. So second slide, please. I think it does mean that we have to work in a very different and sometimes quite uncomfortably different way. I remember when we set up the Children's Centre movement in England, we said it couldn't just be more of the same, because the same wasn't working for the most challenged and vulnerable children. It couldn't any longer be a service in early childhood that's explicitly just for children. It had to be for children in a particular context, a particular community, and in a particular family system. We had to think about that in a very different way. We had to encourage families to participate, and for me, participation is the key word in all of this activism. And people had to believe that they could make a difference and they could reshape their own context where they were living out their lives. They didn't want to anymore be passive recipients of public funds, dollops of public welfare. And I think it was vital that we encouraged them to be critical users of public services. Those 2 little boys in Brazil that I went back and visited, what was most important for me was that one of them had become a photographer, and his photographs had been banned in Brazil because he was exposing some of the challenges to his community. And his brother had become a political worker. So these are what I'm hoping for, that the children that we work with, if we work in this kind of a way, will become more critical of the society in which they're growing up, and will be more effective in building the kind of society they want to be part of. So we're helping people to have the capacity to secure outcomes for themselves. And the best thing that ever happened to me in both Brazil and Papua New Guinea and in Corby was the kind of resistance within movements within the community. And I think our job as activists is to build on the energy in that community. In Corby, there was 75% of the population were Glaswegian workers, and the steelworks had been closed down. There was energy for change there that needed to be harnessed. Women had won a campaign against the local council, and they were very effective in building the local centre for children and families and ensuring that their children had a better deal. I'm going to show you a tiny video clip. If we can have the next slide, please. I think it's vital that all early childhood workers get to know their own community, get to know its history, work with the elders in the community, and take action. So if we can press the video. We need to see the video, okay.
Until the 1980s, Corby was a thriving industrial town. The steelworks dominated the skyline and employed over 10,000 of the town's workers. In 1981, the works closed and male unemployment in the town climbed to more than 43%. When faced with challenging circumstances, the people of Corby will unite to make their voices heard, as they did to speak out for their jobs in the protest marches against the steelworks closures, and to put a stop to imposed cuts to Penn Green services in 2000.
So I've read a lot of Edgar Kahn. He talks about a bit of hell-raising being necessary in most kinds of activism. And it may not make you popular, but it's been very important for us at Penn Green that those green T-shirts that we're wearing in that video come on when we need to make a stand against something that's not right. So the last slide, please, for me. I wanted to just share some concepts that I've learned from working in Brazil, in Papua New Guinea, and also more recently in New Zealand and in Australia. And I think we have a lot to learn from those countries. In New Zealand, the early childhood workers have an anthem which has been taken from mill workers in the early 20th century. And it says, "Don't be too polite, girls, don't be too polite." I think in early childhood, sometimes we are too polite and too compliant, and that has to stop. So my lessons from the Indigenous peoples that I've worked with, including the community in Corby, is take what people offer and always build on it and listen to people and spend time finding out about what it is that matters to local people. Pride matters, and we have to find reciprocal ways of working. I would say look to your elders for help, because I'm 65 and I want people to talk and listen to me too as I go about working in my new town. Don't accept being minoritized and insist on complexity, and if you're seen as trouble, always take it as a compliment. In Brazil, I learned one phrase, dar um jeito, that's been very important all my life, and it means find a way. And I hope that all of you are finding a way in your community. Because my definition of activism, and Fliss and I have come up with two definitions, is a pedagogy of activism requires early childhood educators to have a commitment to transforming the life chances of children and their families by harnessing the energy for change in their local communities. So thank you for hearing that bit. Over to you, Fliss.
Thank you, Margie. I listen to you, Margie. Penn Green is a centre that encourages children to be all they can be. Not only children, but staff and parents. I came here as an inspector of education and was overwhelmed by the interactions between children, staff and parents. I knew I wanted to be part of the Penn Green community and was lucky enough to begin to work here as a researcher in 2006. In 1986, a child was unfortunately murdered in Corby, and the community wanted to protect their children. Penn Green wrote a programme underpinned by our ethos and principles called Learning to be Strong. We prefer to call it an approach, and it has a focus on self-esteem, self-confidence and building resilience. It links with what we want for adults in our group work programme. We want to support adults and parents to be the best they can be. This is an ethos and a philosophy that is embedded throughout Penn Green. The Learning to be Strong programme is mainly constructed with children in the term before they go to school. However, the philosophy and belief is embedded throughout. If I can share with you, my son attends Penn Green Nursery, and we were doing our shopping recently, and a lady said to him, "Excuse me, please, darling." And he turned around to her, he's 3, he turned around to her and he says, "I'm not your darling." So the philosophy of the Learning to be Strong programme, where children should feel strong and advocate for themselves on behalf of themselves, is embedded throughout Penn Green, not just in the last moments before they transition to school. These are some of the issues for children in our centre. I mind about children having no voice and no choice. We have lots of different meetings and different forums for our practitioners to consider what's going on for children and families that are facing these issues. We have coordination meetings, which are co-led by social workers, where we've learnt some of the lessons from our serious case reviews, where information is being held onto by practitioners and not being shared. We keep these conversations alive in these coordination meetings, holding the families in our mind and considering what might be going on for them. We have safer practice meetings where staff and practitioners can share feelings that they're uncomfortable with, that's being projected within them from the families and the children they're working with. We've most recently embarked on some psychoanalytic training and considered the BIC method of observation, where we consider what might be going on for the child and the child's emotional state, and share this as a group of practitioners to think about the strategies that we can support children with. Advocacy, agency and activism are the key concepts that underpin our work at Penn Green. Advocacy in terms of parents and early years educators speaking on behalf of and interceding on behalf of children. Agency, where children, parents and staff believe they can change situations and determine the outcome of events. A child or an adult with high agency will readily become involved in challenging problems and will be appropriately assertive and interactive with their peers. And as Margie says, we've come up with the term of the activism, with the pedagogy of activism, where a reflective teacher, educators construct their practice as part of a struggle for social justice and social change. Penn Green our beliefs about what children need from the important adults in their lives. We believe that children need adults who can contain their emotional needs, who are able to raise children's self-esteem. I won't read the list out to everybody, but it's really hard sometimes for the parents who have never had this for themselves. Parents who haven't had somebody to contain their emotions when they've been upset. Parents who haven't had somebody to hold their emotional needs in mind. And that's why early intervention is so important. If you want parents to have a voice and to make a choice, it's important to support the parents. And many of our parents go on beyond Penn Green to advocate for their children. They work in schools, they work as governors in the local community, they become community police officers. All of our parents are actively involved in all of the services we offer here at Penn Green and make a difference to their own family and their community. What we want is to create an environment to support children to build resilience, to support children to be all they can be. Here's an example of how our pedagogy supports children within our early years environment. So I'll just show a really short clip because I recognise that we're going over time with our presentation. So as an example of how a pedagogy can support children to feel strong, to feel in control, to feel able to choose and make choices about what it is that they would like to do. And then you see them engaging and supporting one another in their play. So just to finish off, about early childhood educators standing on the shoulders of giants to be part of a proud profession. At Penn Green, I do believe we can be builders and maintainers of relationships with children, parents and carers. We can be pedagogical experts, and we are pedagogical experts. And we are committed to emancipatory practice and activism. But we need to have, and we do have at Penn Green, robust professionals with a strong theoretical understanding. All of our practitioners have regular and good supervision and support. There's strong initial training and accredited training, and there's good remuneration and conditions of reference. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Felicity and Margie. I just want to remind all our listeners, you can post questions that you have either for Emma or for Margie or Felicity. So we would really like to invite your questions. Just write them on the panel on the bottom right-hand side. We do have time for discussion. While you're thinking about your questions and maybe writing down your notes, I just want to let all our panelists know that I have one question from a listener that I'd like you all to think about, because I would like to hear both the views from Ireland and Emma, and also from England from Margie and Felicity. The question comes from Nathan Archer, and he asks, in countries that have a mixed market of provision, you know, different kinds of providers, are these divisions, are they getting in the way of collective activism? I guess this is, you know, around the issue of the whole early years coming together in a form of collective activism. How does that work in a situation where you have a mixed market of provision, maybe some public, some private, larger, smaller, etc.? Felicity, can I go to you on that question first? What do you think? How might it work?
Thank you for that, Margaret. I think it's really complex, isn't it, when you've got a system, particularly in the UK, and I think it's replicated in Ireland, although I wouldn't like to be certain, that you have providers, some providers that are that see early years as a business, as opposed to seeing early years as an opportunity to provide learning and development and support for children and families. And I think that sometimes is where the conflict can arise, when a business model is infiltrates the system and therefore doesn't necessarily support the roots of practice and the ethos of many of practitioners. And I'm not saying that all private providers have this ethos, but I know that there are some dominant providers in the UK that don't necessarily advocate for children and families in the way that Penn Green does. So I probably haven't answered your
No, you know, that's fine. Emma, have you got any views on this? Is there the possibility, or what have your experiences been in Ireland, of collective activism, the whole sector coming together?
Yes, I think there's a huge challenge for people who are running services in the private sector, because obviously if there's a business model whose needs need to be met, the idea of increasing wages and improving terms and conditions is bound to be interpreted in that way, in that context. So I think Nathan's question is very accurate, and we do have a mixed market of provision, and I think it does in some way constrain activism which is focused necessarily on advancing our profession. However, I do feel that if we were to have, and we're increasingly coming together in spaces where this is being acknowledged, that there is, you know, there is a collective spirit of everybody being oppressed in a similar way by the state model, which the funding model, you know, which doesn't really give preferential treatment to non-private sectors in Ireland. There isn't really a privileged model of funding, and I think, you know, the only way we're really going to focus the energy is to look for, I think, what is ultimately every child's right, which is a statutory funding model across early years, as well as the more formal education system in Ireland, certainly. You know, teachers don't necessarily have to take two the streets to achieve the, you know, better quality for their services. So I think it's definitely a good point that it does get in the way of collective activism, but certainly I think there's more to unite us than there is to divide us in Ireland.
Thanks, Emma. That's a nice way to be ending positive on that issue. I'd like to go back to the individual service level. You know, we've talked about uniting as a whole sector at a national level. If we go back to the individual setting, I'd like just to pick up on 5 issues that I was really struck listening to Margie's presentation, and this is something that every practitioner could engage in as an individual practitioner, with a group of children, working with families, working with colleagues. Firstly, and this was also came up in Emma's presentation, the importance of critical reflection. This seems to be coming up again and again in this discussion. Secondly, the need to get to know the community you work in. Really know your community as individuals, what the issues are, and indeed in knowing the community, look to the elders in the community to help out. Another issue is building on the energy in the community. You know, I love the term, you know, a bit of hell raising. Is it maybe a good idea? And don't be too polite. One of the issues that has come up amongst our listeners, and this is a question that was raised in the last few days, I mean, you're coming from countries where there has been democracy for many, many years. A little bit of hell raising is not so strange, and you know, often you do get a response. But some of our listeners are concerned about, you know, in countries which are new to democracy, where really there may be an awful lot of corruption, you know, in government. People are not so used to getting out there on the street and marching. How would you respond to practitioners who are, you know, coming from post-communist countries, where the notion of hell raising is, yeah, this is just not part of their way of thinking and doing, and maybe a little bit cynical that, you know, they can go and protest marches, object, but actually nothing is going to change. Have you any advice? And I'm going first to Margie on this. Any advice for people in these kind of countries, post-communist countries, where, you know, they may be a little bit cynical about whether any activist efforts will make any difference whatsoever? Margie, maybe not listening to hear. Felicity?
Can you hear? Can
yes,
you hear? Sorry, Margie, yeah. Sorry. My only experience of working in post-communist countries is we had an exchange program with Novgorod, and we learned as much from going there as they did from coming to us. But I do think it was the exchange of views with practitioners in other countries that helped those Novgorod practitioners enormously, and there are funds now for exchange programs between those countries, and I think it shifted professional practice both for us and for them. Can you hear? Sorry, are you still hearing me?
Yes, we're hearing you. Keep going, keep going.
I think in 1911 in this country, the Board of Inquiry for Education said that every early childhood practitioner should have the right to visit another country and see what practice was like. And for me, that isn't just lovely trips to Reggio Emilia where the sun shines and the practice is wonderful. It's about going to each other's settings and challenging and thinking about how we can shift practice and learn from each other. So I guess my advice would be, I know that this summer I'm teaching on a summer school which is 42 countries, I think, coming together in Budapest. And I think that's a program which is all about sharing ideas across the world, and I think it's when you share ideas like that that you see things don't have have to stay the way they are. And I'm a strong trade unionist. I don't know how trade unionism goes down in all of those countries, but I think it is critical that we join together, public, private, voluntary, not-for-profit, profit. It will be harder with some of those settings and for some of those settings, but we have to join together. And for me, New Zealand has taught us how to do that. And I think we have to come out of our own setting and go and see other people's settings. And there was mutual learning there for everybody.
Okay, thanks a lot, Margie. Useful advice. Yeah, visit each other's settings, cross-country, brilliant. Actually, the opportunities like webinars is an opportunity to get insight into other countries without always the expense of traveling. But there are a few more questions, and I'm going to go to Felicity with this question first. Felicity, this is for you. The words critical and reflection are being used by all of the panelists today, sometimes together as critical reflection. So this Verity Campbell Barr would like you to say, what exactly do you mean when you refer to critical reflection? What do you mean by that? What do they think being critical and reflection means? So, yeah, it's one of these terms that we are using very easily in the early years these days. So can you explain in very concrete terms what you mean by critical reflection?
Absolutely. I mean, for us at Penn Green, critical reflection, it goes throughout the organisation, and we encourage children to critically reflect. I think for us, it means really focusing not just on your own, but having time and space alongside others to consider your own practice and to draw on theory that will help you to consider your own practice, and then to adapt and reflect on your pedagogy so it's responsive to the needs of children and families that you're working with. So the forums that I've already discussed, particularly support and supervision, is a forum for you to be alongside somebody else that will help you to reflect, critically reflect, so critique your own practice, and consider whether or not you are having an impact or what else can be done to facilitate and support the learning and development of children, and how you are working alongside other practitioners, other children and parents.
So if I understand correctly, you're talking about, having a mentor alongside with you to look at your practice together. So it's like a friend, a mentor who's really questioning with you if you're having an impact.
Absolutely, and it could be somebody that is working alongside you, and in our context, we're a multidisciplinary team, so we have different professional heritages working within this one organisation. So we have social workers, people who have a professional heritage in their health construct, and we have early years educators and teachers. So it could be practitioners that you're working with that may have a different professional heritage to your own, that may challenge and encourage you to consider an alternative perspective in terms of how you are working with children and families. We also use video as a catalyst to reflect on our practice. So we often would capture a piece of footage of a child within the setting, and as a small group of practitioners reflect on how me as a practitioner is interacting with that child, what the child is actually gaining from that experience, how can I ensure that that child's learning and development needs are being met, can I do anything different, and I think, as a team of practitioners, to have the opportunity to critically reflect on your practice keeps your practice alive and refreshed.
So this multidisciplinary team you have sounds very impressive. You're talking about health workers, social workers and early childhood practitioners all working side by side, correct?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's right, Margaret.
And how, in terms of the communication, are there challenges in that? You know, people coming from very different backgrounds. Are there disagreements? Is it always positive, I guess is what I'm asking you, having all of these disciplines working as colleagues?
And the short answer is no, it's not always positive, but actually the principles in terms of having the best possible outcomes for children and families is something that is innate within anybody that works within Penn Green. So the ultimate aim and objective is there. It's how you get there and how we work collaboratively as a team in order to consider how we can best support a child and their family. Hello.
And so that overall vision is really helping in giving direction to your work and also dealing with any difficulties you might be having, you know, between different colleagues with different disciplinary backgrounds. So if you have a common vision and a common goal, that really helps clearly. Can I ask the same question to Emma about how you understand critical reflection? Emma.
Yes, and may I just acknowledge that it's wonderful to be asked a question by somebody like Verity Campbell-Barr, whose own work is something that I've drawn on in mine. So it's wonderful to have that input. I think we would see it very much similarly to Penn Green in that it involves multiple perspectives. But I think it's the types of questioning that that you bring to reflection which make it critical. So it's definitely questioning with openness to change, and it's particular questions like, you know, who's privileged or prioritized by this this area of either practice or this process that we're reflecting upon. And sometimes, and particularly in the kinds of conversations around child welfare and child well-being, it's also around, you know, who's protected by processes and procedures that we're questioning. So where we're trying to bring practitioners who are definitely not used to critical reflection, where we're trying to bring them is to be braver, to know that they are drawing from a very sound professional knowledge and a very sound practitioner knowledge when it comes to advocating on behalf of and with children and families, and to do that in a brave way. I mean, one example we would have really is perhaps around the area of what's referred to as, you know, special needs. In other words, children who may have specific requirements arising from impairment. And we're trying to get practitioners to draw on their knowledge of all children and their expertise in relation to what processes and experiences work for children to convince them that they actually have everything they need to be able to meet the needs of children, and that sometimes they should critically reflect on whether the model that they're being offered to a child based on a diagnosis is entirely suitable, appropriate, or compatible with effective early childhood practice. So that's a bridge beyond where most of us would have started in college, which is where reflective practice was, you know, too often centered on activities and experiences from the practitioner perspective. Did it work? Did it not work? What would I do better? We're trying to bring people into a much more holistic questioning and a brave questioning, but very much with the child and the family and their authenticity and experiences and voices at the centre.
So these questions that are being posed, the actual questions are really, really important in stimulating a critical, reflective approach to your work. The choice of questions are important. We have on the screen now the list of questions that I showed at the very beginning of our webinar that our listeners had submitted. And I would like to now focus on question 3. Does activism in early childhood practice need to be public, vocal and visible? We saw some great footage from Penn Green of, you know, a very visible and vocal protest march. on the street, and I'm going to ask this question firstly to Margie. You know, you talked passionately about hell raising and not being too polite. Does activism, does it have to be public, vocal and visible, or are there other approaches to activism which may also have a positive impact on children's lives?
I think I have to go back to something that was said before. I mean, I've worked in early childhood for 44 years, and I've had to march every single year of those 44 years. So it makes me very angry that at 65 I'm still having to march. But I think early years is a very marginalised profession, I suppose, but we can do something about that. And I think being brave is right. And I love Verity's question. I think that being reflexive is very, very important, and being courageous is important. But we have to also tolerate a dissensus a lot more than we are accustomed to doing, certainly in England, although I think other countries are better at it. I mean, arguing...
Margie, can I interrupt you? I just missed what you said there. We have to tolerate
dissensus. It's called, I mean, if you think that mostly what we go for in early childhood, certainly in England, is consensus. We want everybody to agree. We are very, if anybody's read the book Pollyanna, we are very Pollyanna-ish. We all want everybody to be nice. Now, I learned in other countries, in Brazil and in Papua New Guinea, that people could tolerate dissensus, people not agreeing, rather more. And I think for me, critical reflection has to have some of that, tolerating different voices, being challenged and made uncomfortable, discombobulated, whatever the word is that you want to use. And I'm glad I've had those experiences, even though they're uncomfortable. For example, I'm a grandmother of a wonderful grandson, Tom, who has what I would call special rights. And I think if you don't call it impairment or disability, and you start calling it special rights, that's a form of activism. It can be quite quiet. It can be quite gentle, but actually the first time I heard somebody describing disabled children as children with special rights rather than special needs, it made me think. So I think activism can just be about making somebody think, and that can be a little bit uncomfortable, but I don't think we're on this earth to make people comfortable. So that's okay, and I think it's very important. So I think activism can be quiet and gentle. Indeed, one of the most amazing settings in England, where my grandson went to school in Stockport, there were very gentle, authoritative teachers there, but my goodness, they made you think. So yes, it doesn't have to be marching in the streets, except that our centre would have closed down 100 times if we hadn't, but it must be about making a stand. But you can make a stand quite gently and quite, but you have to be authoritative.
And do you think everybody is capable of making this stand? Because I've also heard it said, listen, you know, some people are just good at this. You know, not everybody is cut out to be an activist or an advocate. Do you think it is a requirement of everybody working with young children, whatever their background, whatever their level of qualifications, whether they've come from vocational background or whether they have degrees or masters? Is it a requirement for everybody, and is everybody capable of this approach?
I think everybody, well, I believe that everybody who comes into early childhood, and I've been amazed working on 3 continents at the energy and commitment of people, whatever their qualifications. It is a requirement to be interested in and passionate about social justice. How you manifest that will be different. I think sometimes it's quite a simple thing. For example, when we talk about the problems of teenagers, pregnant teenagers, do we have the pregnant teenagers in the room? When we talk about the challenges for the traveller community in this country and in Western Europe and Eastern Europe, do we actually have the traveller people in the room? So I think one of the things I've learned is actually hearing people's stories has such a huge impact in terms of transforming people's ways of thinking and their practice. And that can be so helpful. So I think invite the minoritized and marginalized people in the room, or go to where they are, because probably that's what you'll have to do. And I think all practitioners can be exposed to that through their initial training perhaps, but definitely their post-qualifying training. And we need to do much more of that.
Okay, thanks very much, Margie. A great response. And now I'm just conscious of the time, and I'd like to bring the webinar to a good closing, but I would like to go back to each of our panelists and ask you, have you got one final piece of advice that you would like to share with the listeners, to a hopeful message, to give support going forward on this issue? So keeping in mind that we have listeners who are practitioners, we have listeners who are involved in training and professional development, we have listeners who are members of NGOs, we have got policymakers from the European policy, so a very broad range of listenership here. So Emma, can I go to you first? Have you got a piece of advice that you would like to share, something to take away from today's webinar in going forward? Emma, are you hearing me? Well, then I'm going to go first to Felicity, because I'm not sure whether we still have Emma with us. And Felicity, can I start with you? What is your piece of advice you'd like to share with listeners today?
I've got two pieces of advice. The first one, I think, is if we care about social justice and the rights of all children, we must be able to juggle all the different aspects of being a practitioner that we've already spoken about. So manage to juggle the aspects of building and maintaining relationships with children and parents, being that pedagogical expert, and be committed to emancipatory practice and activism. And then I think we need really good and strong leaders who will put in place all the things that we need as practitioners: robust professional and strong theoretical understanding, good supervision support, good training, good CPD, and good remuneration. And my second piece of advice is to join a trade union.
Hi, can you hear me now? Hello?
Oh, Emma?
Hi, sorry. I just want to completely endorse what Felicity has said just there. I think it's great advice. I just had one very small phrase that was given to me recently, which is, I know, helped me in my own critical reflection. And it was just, instead of always making sure that we do the right things, because we're very good at doing the right things in early childhood practice, maybe we should focus on doing the right thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Emma. And now your turn, Margie. Your piece of advice for our listeners today on this issue.
I think go back, and you have to learn from history. And a very famous man once said, "There's no such thing as a child in isolation. There's a child in a set of relationships." So the parents have a critical role, and it's not thought about enough. Parents' critical role as mediators, brokers, advocates for their children throughout the education system is what's needed if we are to change, if we are to transform the life chances of the most challenged children. And early childhood settings are the perfect place in which to support parents to be the mediators, brokers and advocates their children need. I mean, the cliche is it takes a village to bring up a child. It's an urban cliche, but it is so true. So I would suggest everybody goes and reads Sarah Hardy, Mothers and Others, and Alison Gopnik, Carpenters and Gardeners. Brilliant books written from an anthropological perspective. You know, early childhood settings, you are allo parents in those settings. You are supporting the parents and being with the children all day as their principal carers during that time, and it's a critical role, but it has to be a shared role.
Thanks a lot, Margie. So we have some very concrete sound advice: joining a trade union, getting in touch with parents, caring about social justice, doing the right thing, I'm now going to address all our listeners today and ask you, can you think about one action that you are going to take responsibility for as a result of what you've heard today about activism and advocacy in early childhood? If anybody feels brave enough to share their actions, please write it in the questions panel, and then so we'll have an idea of how today's discussion has impacted on your thinking today. I'd also like to use this opportunity to let you know that the next webinar in this series will take place on the 15th of June. And this webinar will be an opportunity to discuss some of the findings, one of the early childhood workforce initiative country studies. This time Peru, so we will be focusing on Peru, and at the same time we'll also be discussing a landscape analysis of training and professional development across the world. So interesting topics indeed. So keep an eye on the website for more information about that webinar. Next slide, please, Shusha. If you've got any feedback or any questions about today's webinar, I'd like you to address those to Michaela UNESCO, whose email should appear on your screen now. So Michaela will be very happy to hear any comments at all on what you heard today, any feedback. It can be as basic as whether, you know, sound was good and if you would like to be more involved, etc. So any feedback at all, we would love to hear from you. And finally, I would like to give a big thank you to our panelists, to Emma Byrne McNamee in Dublin, to Felicity Norton and Margie Wally in England. We really welcomed your contributions, some very sound advice and insights. Thank you very much for participating. I would also like to thank all of the listeners for your participation today. I hope you heard something that you can take forward and work on in your daily work. And a few behind-the-scenes people I would also like to thank: Shusha Sesti, Michaela UNESCO, and Julia Cortelesi for all your help on behind the scenes. So till next time, thank you and goodbye.